I'm Sharon, 34 female. I live alone in the quiet, two-story house that was once my childhood home, a place now filled with the echoes of a life that has ended and a future that has been stolen. For the past 5 years, my world shrank to these four walls, my career as a freelance graphic designer pushed to late nights and early mornings, all to care for my ailing father, Robert. This story is about how my 5 years of devotion were erased in a 5-minute video call, and how a box of old journals became my only weapon to reclaim my life. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. The silence in the house was a new phenomenon. For 5 years, it had been filled with the sounds of living and dying, the gentle hum of the oxygen concentrator, the beep of the blood pressure cuff, the soft shuffle of slippers on hardwood, and the cadence of my father's breathing, which I had become so attuned to that I could tell his mood by its rhythm. Now, the only sound was the low drone of the refrigerator and the frantic thumping of my own heart. It had been a week since Dad passed. A week of hollow quiet. My life before the 5 years, as I'd come to call them, felt like a movie someone else had starred in. I had a small but stylish apartment downtown, a thriving freelance business, and a social life that involved gallery openings and weekend trips. When Dad got his diagnosis, a degenerative neurological condition that was as cruel as it was relentless, there was no dramatic family meeting. There was just a phone call. My sister, Jessica, called from her chic apartment in London. "Oh, Sharon, it's just awful," she'd said, her voice laced with a performative sorrow that always grated on me. "I'm in the middle of closing a huge fund. I can't possibly get away. You're there, you can handle the initial arrangements, right? Find him a good facility." A facility, that was her solution. The idea of putting Dad, a man who designed buildings to feel like homes, into a sterile, anonymous room made my stomach turn. He was a retired architect, a man who believed that our surroundings shaped our souls. He loved his home, the one he'd built with my mother, filled with books on history, art, and blueprints of his life's work. "He's not going to a facility, Jess," I said, my voice tight. "He's staying here. He wants to be home." "Well, how is that going to work?" she'd scoffed. "You have a life, a career." "I'll manage," I said, though I had no idea how. And so it began. I gave up my apartment, moved my design studio into my old childhood bedroom, and became my father's primary caregiver. The first year was a blur of learning, medication schedules, physical therapy exercises, how to navigate the labyrinth of the healthcare system. Dad was still mostly himself then, his mind sharp even as his body began to betray him. We'd spend evenings on the porch, a blanket over his legs, while he told me stories about the buildings he'd designed, his voice still full of passion. Jessica's involvement was minimal and curated for an audience. She would call once a week, always on speakerphone so Dad could hear. The calls were brief, filled with her impressive-sounding updates about her work as a venture capitalist. She'd talk about funding rounds, tech startups, and trips to Dubai and Singapore. To Dad, she painted a picture of a daughter conquering the world. "I'm making you proud, Dad," she'd say. "I'm building an empire, just like you did with your buildings." He would smile, a flicker of pride in his tired eyes. He loved hearing about her success. She sent money, not a lot, but enough to feel like a contribution. A few $100s here and there, wired with a note that said, "For Dad's comforts." I never told her that Dad's comforts often meant a new prescription that cost more than her contribution, or a specialized piece of medical equipment. The bulk of the expenses and the mortgage on the house I covered with my freelance work, taking on dull corporate projects that paid well but chipped away at my creative spirit. As the years wore on, Dad's condition worsened. His speech became slurred, and his memory began to fray at the edges. There were good days and bad days. On good days, we'd look through old photo albums, and he'd point out a young version of my mother, a tear rolling down his cheek. On bad days, he wouldn't know who I was, his eyes filled with a terrifying vacancy. During these years, Jessica's calls became a source of strange friction. She developed a habit of asking to speak to Dad alone. "Just for a minute, Sharon," she'd say sweetly. Sister-daughter secrets. I'd leave the room, placing the phone on the stand next to his armchair. I could hear the murmur of her voice, but not the words. When I'd return, Dad would often seem agitated. Or confused. Jess says you're struggling, he said one evening, his words slow and difficult. She says you're tired of this. I was floored. What? No, Dad, I'm fine, we're fine. He looked at me, his gaze searching. She's worried. She offered to arrange for professional help, full-time. We have Brenda, I reminded him gently. Brenda was the part-time home care nurse who came 3 times a week. She was a godsend, a warm, no-nonsense woman who treated Dad with dignity and me with a knowing sympathy. Jessica thinks we need more, he insisted. She said you're sacrificing your entire life, that it's not fair to you. It sounded like concern, but it was packaged in a way that made me feel like a failure, like my care was inadequate. Jessica was planting seeds of doubt, positioning herself as the one who was truly looking out for both of us from thousands of miles away. The last year was the hardest. Dad was mostly bedridden. My world was the size of his room. I learned to read the stories in the flicker of his eyes, to understand his needs from the slightest gesture. I held his hand through painful procedures, I read to him from his favorite history books, and I reassured him during his moments of panic and confusion. Jessica visited once. It was a flying trip, 24 hours squeezed between business meetings in New York. She arrived with expensive gifts, a cashmere blanket he couldn't feel, a bottle of aged scotch he couldn't drink. She took a flurry of photos, her arm around his frail shoulders, his face wan and bewildered. The photos appeared on her social media later that day, captioned, "So good to be home with my hero. Family is everything." The hypocrisy was breathtaking. Brenda, the nurse, saw it all. She saw me wrestling with insurance companies on the phone. She saw me coaxing Dad to eat when he had no appetite. She saw me fall asleep in the chair by his bed, my laptop still balanced on my knees. "You're a good daughter, Sharon," she told me one afternoon, her voice soft but firm as she checked his vitals. "A truly good daughter. Don't you ever let anyone make you think otherwise." In his final weeks, Dad was mostly unresponsive. He held onto my hand, his grip surprisingly strong. Jessica called, her voice trembling with what sounded like real grief. She said she was trying to get a flight, but a big deal was closing and she couldn't get away. "Tell him I love him," she whispered. I did. I sat by his bed and told him all the things he meant to me, how taking care of him was the hardest and most important thing I had ever done. And then, one quiet Tuesday morning, he was gone. The silence he left behind was deafening. The funeral was a small, quiet affair. Just a few of Dad's old friends, some neighbors, and me. Jessica attended via a live stream, a small, pixelated face on a tablet I propped up on a pew. She delivered a eulogy she'd emailed to the officiant, a beautifully written piece about her globe-trotting architect father who inspired her to build her own legacy. It was eloquent, touching, and felt completely detached from the man I had just spent 5 years with. It was a tribute to the father of her social media feed, not the father who needed help cutting his food. A week later came the reading of the will. Dad's lawyer, a man I'd never met named Mr. Klein, arranged it over Zoom. It seemed fitting in a horribly impersonal way. My entire life had become remote and disconnected, so why not have it formally dismantled over a video conference? I sat at the heavy oak desk in Dad's study, the room where he'd sketched out his dreams on drafting paper. The smell of old books and pipe tobacco, though he hadn't smoked in years, still lingered in the air. I logged into the meeting, my stomach a knot of anxiety. I wasn't expecting much. Dad and I had never talked about the will. I assumed it would be a straightforward split between Jessica and me, which was fine. I wasn't in this for a reward. The house was the main asset, and I figured we would have to sell it, a painful but necessary step. Mr. Klein appeared on screen, a man with a bland face and a starched collar. "Good afternoon, Sharon," he said, his tone professionally somber. A moment later, Jessica's face popped into a second window. She was in a bright, airy office, a city skyline visible behind her. She was wearing a sharp, tailored blazer and looked composed, her expression one of solemn duty. "Hello, Sharon, Mr. Klein," she said, her voice smooth as silk. "Thank you both for being here," Mr. Klein began, shuffling some papers off screen. "I was Robert's attorney for the last 2 years. He came to me to update his last will and testament. I will now read the pertinent sections." He cleared his throat and began to read in a dry monotone. The legal language was dense, but the meaning slowly began to slice through the jargon. He spoke of Dad's assets, the house, his portfolio of stocks and bonds, his personal effects. My brie. Ath hitched in my chest. This was it. To my beloved daughter, Jessica, in recognition of her unwavering support, her financial contributions to my care, and her brilliant success which brought me such immense pride, I bequeath my entire estate. This includes the property at 123 Maple Lane, all financial accounts, and the entirety of my worldly possessions. The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating, entire estate. The phrase echoed in the silent study. I stared at the screen, my mind refusing to process what I'd just heard. It had to be a mistake. A typo. Maybe I'd misheard. "I'm sorry," I interrupted, my voice a croak. "Did you say entire estate?" Mr. Klein looked up, his expression unchanging. "Yes, that is correct." I looked at Jessica's window on the screen. She was dabbing at the corner of her eye with a fingertip, her face a mask of sorrowful surprise. "Oh my," she whispered. I had no idea. Dad, what were you thinking?" It was a masterful performance. She looked shocked, humbled, and burdened by this unexpected generosity. My name came next. Mr. Klein continued reading, "To my daughter, Sharon, I leave my love and my hope that she will find her own path to independence, free from the burdens that she has carried. I have made this decision with a clear mind, believing it is the best way to ensure both my daughters are cared for in the manner they most need. Free from the burdens, independence." The words were a slap in the face. It wasn't a will, it was a judgment. It painted me as a dependent, a burden he was freeing my sister from. The 5 years I had given him, the career I had sacrificed, the life I had put on hold, it was all reframed as a liability. I wasn't a caregiver, I was a charity case. My hands began to shake. I couldn't breathe. The room felt like it was closing in on me. I looked at Jessica's perfect, grieving face on the screen and saw a flash of something in her eyes, not surprise, but triumph. A cool, calculated victory. She knew. She had known this was coming. "Jessica," I said, my voice trembling with a rage that was starting to burn through the shock. "Did you know about this?" She met my gaze, her own eyes welling up with convincing tears. "Of course not, Sharon. How could you even ask that? I'm as shocked as you are. I don't even know what to say. It's too much." But I knew she was lying. I could feel it in my bones. This was her handiwork. Those secret phone calls, the whispers about me being overwhelmed, the narrative she'd spun about being the successful, supportive daughter while I was the struggling, resentful one, it had all been part of a long, deliberate campaign. She hadn't just wanted a share of the estate, she had wanted all of it. And she had wanted to humiliate me in the process. "I have to go," I managed to choke out. I clicked end meeting without waiting for a response, plunging the room back into silence. The screen went dark, but their faces were burned into my mind. Mr. Klein's indifference and Jessica's deceptive sympathy. I sat there for a long time, the silence of the house pressing down on me. I felt utterly erased. My father, the man whose hand I held as he took his last breath, had signed a document that effectively denied my existence, my sacrifice. He had chosen the daughter who sent money and curated photos over the one who had given him her life. The grief I had been processing for a week was instantly curdled by a profound and bitter betrayal. I looked around the study at the books on the shelves, the architectural drawings framed on the walls, the worn leather of his favorite armchair. According to that document, none of it was mine. I was a guest in my own home, a ghost in my own life. Jessica, my globetrotting sister, owned it all. The house would be sold. I would have to leave. I had nothing. The last 5 years hadn't just been a sacrifice, they had been a complete and total dead end. The days that followed the Zoom call were a gray, formless fog. I moved through the house like an automaton, packing my life into cardboard boxes. Each object I touched felt like an accusation. The Aida cloth and embroidery threads from a cross-stitch project I'd started and abandoned 3 years ago. The stack of graphic design magazines I'd never had time to read. They were artifacts of a life I'd meant to live. Now, Jessica was the legal owner of everything, and I was a squatter with a deadline. She had emailed me the day after the will reading. The subject line was simply, "Thinking of you." The email was a masterpiece of condescending sympathy. "Dearest Sharon," it began, "I'm still reeling. I know this must be so confusing and painful for you. I want you to know that I'm here for you. We'll figure this out together. Of course, you can stay in the house for as long as you need to get back on your feet. Let's say 3 months, that seems fair. I'll handle all the bills from now on, so you don't have to worry about it. Thing. Get back on your feet. The implication was that I was on the ground, helpless, 3 months, a ticking clock on my homelessness. I'll handle the bills, a reminder of who was in control. Every sentence was a perfectly polished barb disguised as kindness. She finished by saying she would need to hire an estate agent soon to get the house valued, just to get the process started. I didn't reply. What could I say? Thank you for your generosity. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, filled with venomous words I couldn't bring myself to type. Arguing felt pointless. She had won. She had a legal document signed by our father. I had nothing but a hollowed-out feeling in my chest. A week into my packing, the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. My social circle had dwindled to almost nothing over the past 5 years. I opened the door to find Brenda, the nurse, standing on the porch. She was holding a worn cardboard box in her arms, her expression a mixture of sorrow and resolve. "Brenda," I said, surprised. "Hi, what are you doing here?" "Hello, Sharon," she said, her voice soft. "I'm so sorry for your loss. I would have come sooner, but I wanted to give you some space." Her eyes were kind, and for the first time in a week, I felt a flicker of warmth. "Thank you, it's been a lot," I said, my voice catching. I stepped aside to let her in. She walked into the living room, now stark and cluttered with half-packed boxes. She took in the scene with a sad, knowing look. "I heard about the will," she said quietly. I flinched. News travels fast. "Your friend who was at the funeral mentioned it to a colleague of mine," she explained. "Sharon, I know it's none of my business, but what I heard didn't sound right. It didn't sound like your father at all." A bitter laugh escaped my lips. "Tell me about it. Apparently, 5 years of my life meant nothing. He left everything to Jessica." Brenda set the cardboard box down on the coffee table. It was a simple banker's box, sealed with a single piece of packing tape. My father's familiar, architectural handwriting was on the top, "For Sharon." I stared at it. "What is this?" "Your father gave it to me about a month before he passed," Brenda said, her gaze steady and serious. "He was having a rare good day. He was lucid, completely clear. He pulled me aside after you'd gone to the pharmacy. He was very specific with his instructions." She leaned forward, her voice dropping lower. "He told me, Brenda, if anything happens to me and things don't go the way they should, I need you to give this box to Sharon. And only to Sharon. Wait a week or 2 after I'm gone. She'll need it then." I asked him what he meant, but he just shook his head and said, "She'll know." He seemed afraid. My heart started to pound, a slow, heavy drumbeat against my ribs. Afraid? My father? I looked from Brenda's earnest face to the box. "For Sharon." His handwriting was shaky but unmistakable. "I didn't know what to do," Brenda continued. "It felt strange, but I promised him. When I heard what your sister did, I knew this was the moment he was talking about. This is what he meant by, if things don't go the way they should." I reached out a trembling hand and touched the lid of the box. It was real. It wasn't a dream. A box from my father, delivered by his trusted nurse, with a cryptic warning. "Thank you, Brenda," I whispered, my throat tight with emotion. "Thank you for this, for everything." "He loved you more than anything, Sharon," she said, squeezing my arm. "He told me all the time. He saw everything you did for him. Don't ever doubt that." After she left, I sat on the floor in front of the coffee table, just staring at the box. It felt heavy, not just in weight, but with significance. For days, I had felt like my father had betrayed me, had erased me. But this box, this was a message from him, a final piece of communication. With a deep breath, I peeled back the packing tape. The cardboard flaps fell open, revealing the contents. The box was filled to the brim with journals, not the fancy, leather-bound kind. These were simple, spiral-bound notebooks, the kind you buy at a drugstore. There were at least a dozen of them, each one filled with my father's dense, slightly slanted script. I lifted the first one out. The date on the first page was almost exactly 5 years ago, right after I had moved back in. I opened it and began to read. October 12th. Sharon moved in today. Her energy fills this quiet house again. It feels less like a tomb and more like a home. I feel a pang of guilt pulling her from her life. But a selfish part of me is grateful. I don't want to be alone. I picked up another from the middle of the stack. The handwriting was less steady. June 4th. Spoke to Jessica today. She is a firecracker, that one, so ambitious. But she worries me. She asked again about power of attorney, said it would be easier for her to manage my finances from London. IT. Old Her Sharon handles everything perfectly well. There was a strange silence on the line. She pushes too hard sometimes. It's as if she sees my life as a business to be managed, an asset to be acquired. My hands were shaking as I read. This wasn't just a record of his illness. It was a record of his thoughts, his fears, his observations. It was his voice, clear and unfiltered, speaking to me from beyond the grave. I stayed up all night, surrounded by the open notebooks, the air thick with the smell of paper and ink. I read about his frustration with his failing body, his gratitude for my patience, his pride in my artwork. And woven throughout it all was a growing thread of anxiety about Jessica. He was chronicling her manipulation in real time, often without even realizing the full extent of what she was doing. This box wasn't just a collection of memories. It was evidence. It was truth. And as the sun began to rise, casting a pale light on the scattered journals, I felt something I hadn't felt since that horrible Zoom call, a tiny, fragile flicker of hope. My father hadn't erased me after all. He had given me a weapon. The next 2 weeks were a blur of caffeine and ink-stained fingers. I lived inside those journals, treating them not as diaries, but as a complex, coded manuscript that held the key to my future. I bought a pack of colored sticky notes and a set of highlighters, turning my father's study, the very room where I'd been so thoroughly disinherited, into a command center. The house was still filled with half-packed boxes, but they were no longer a symbol of defeat. Now they were just clutter I would deal with later. My real work was here, in the pages of these notebooks. I arranged the journals chronologically, creating a timeline of my father's last 5 years. As I read, a devastatingly clear picture began to emerge. It was the story of a man who loved both his daughters, but was slowly and systematically poisoned against one of them by the other. The early entries were full of love for both of us. He wrote about my care with deep gratitude. Sharon has the patience of a saint. She made my favorite soup today, just like her mother used to. It's in these small moments I find so much joy. He wrote of Jessica's ambition with a father's pride. Heard from Jess today. She's in talks to fund a new biotech firm. The girl is brilliant. She has a mind for business I could never comprehend. But as time went on, a new theme appeared. It started subtly. Jessica called. We had a nice chat, but she kept asking about the house finances. She suggested I put her name on the deed to protect the asset in case I needed to go into long-term care. I told her I have no intention of going into care. She said she was just thinking ahead. It left me feeling unsettled. This entry was from 3 years ago. I flagged it with a red sticky note. Then came more. Another call with Jess. She brought up Sharon's finances. She asked if I was paying Sharon for her help. I told her no, Sharon won't accept anything. Jessica said that was concerning, that Sharon was becoming financially dependent on the situation and wouldn't be able to stand on her own 2 feet when this was all over. She said I would be doing Sharon a disservice by not encouraging her independence. It sounds so logical when she says it, but it doesn't feel right. Sharon works every night on her computer. She is not idle. My blood ran cold. Jessica had been planting these ideas for years. The exact phrases from the will, independence, free from burdens, were all there in my father's own handwriting, recorded as things Jessica had told him. She had written her own justification into his mind, word by word, over hundreds of phone calls. The most damning entries came from the last 2 years, the period when Mr. Klein had become his lawyer and the new will was drafted. Jessica has found a new lawyer for me, a Mr. Klein. She says my old one, Bill, is too small town, and that with my assets, I need someone more sophisticated who understands international finance since she lives abroad. She arranged a video call. It all seems so complicated. Spoke with Mr. Klein today. Jessica was on the call too, to help translate the legal jargon. They talked about trusts and estate planning. It was mostly over my head. Jessica suggested a new will would be the cleanest way to handle things. She said it would be a simple document that would protect me and ensure fairness for everyone. A very bad day. My hands are shaking so much I can barely write. Jessica called and was very upset. She said she'd heard from one of the neighbors that I'd had a fall. It was just a stumble. She said Sharon wasn't telling her the truth about how bad things are. She cried on the phone. She said she felt helpless, so far away. She said the only thing that would give her peace of mind would be knowing that the estate was secure, that there was a clear plan. She said, "Dad, I just want to know that you trust me to handle things." Her tears are a powerful weapon. The entry that broke my heart and solidified my rage came from the month the will was signed. I'm signing the new will today. Mr. Klein is sending a notary. I feel a profound sense of unease. The will leaves everything to Jessica. This was her idea. She convinced me it was the only way. She said she would, of course, split everything fairly with Sharon, but that putting it all in her name legally was the smartest financial move. She said it would protect the assets from being depleted by Sharon's lack of financial planning. She said once everything was settled, she would give Sharon her half and help her invest it wisely. She said, "This way, Dad, you are taking care of both of us. You are giving Sharon the gift of a secure future, managed by me." It sounds like a betrayal, but she cried and said I was questioning her love. I am so tired, so confused. I will sign it, I will trust her, but I am keeping these journals. Something tells me Sharon will need to see them one day. A backup plan, a record of the truth. There it was, the entire scheme laid bare in my father's own conflicted, sorrowful words. He hadn't betrayed me. He had been coerced. He was a sick, tired, and confused old man, and his brilliant, manipulative daughter had preyed on his love and his fear, twisting them into a weapon against me. He signed the will under duress, under the false promise that she would do the right thing. And in his heart, he knew she might not, so he created his own insurance policy, this box of journals. I sat back, the final journal resting in my lap. The rage was still there, but it was now cold and sharp. It was no longer the hot, messy anger of a victim. It was the focused anger of someone with a purpose. Jessica hadn't just stolen my inheritance. She had abused our father's trust in his most vulnerable state. She had used his love as a tool for financial gain. That was unforgivable. I gathered the journals, stacking them neatly. I marked every relevant page with a color-coded tab. Red for mentions of the will and finances, yellow for Jessica's direct quotes about my supposed dependency, blue for Dad's expressions of gratitude for my care, and green for his expressions of doubt or fear about Jessica's motives. When I was done, the journals looked like a legal dossier. They were no longer just diaries. They were a detailed affidavit, a posthumous testimony from the victim of a crime. My father's voice was about to be heard again, not in a quiet living room, but in a court of law. And this time, Jessica wouldn't be able to control the narrative. Finding the right lawyer felt like the most critical decision of my life. I couldn't go to Mr. Klein, the man Jessica had handpicked. He was, at best, a pawn in her game and, at worst, a willing participant. I needed someone who specialized in this exact kind of fight, contested wills, estate litigation, and a concept I'd learned about in my frantic late-night research: undue influence. After a week of vetting attorneys online, I found her. Ms. Anya Sharma. Her firm's website was sleek and professional, but it was her bio that caught my eye. She was described as a fierce advocate for the vulnerable, with a track record of unraveling complex financial and emotional manipulation in estate disputes. She sounded like a surgeon, someone who could expertly dissect Jessica's web of lies. I booked a consultation, my stomach churning with a mixture of hope and fear. I packed the box of journals into a sturdy canvas tote bag, the weight of them feeling like armor. Ms. Sharma's office was in a modern glass tower downtown, a world away from the quiet, suburban street I'd been confined to. She met me in the lobby herself. She was a woman in her mid-40s, sharp and impeccably dressed, with intelligent eyes that missed nothing. She didn't offer platitudes or sympathies. She shook my hand firmly and led me to a conference room with a panoramic view of the city. "Tell me everything," she said, opening a notepad. "Start from the beginning." I talked for nearly an hour, my voice steady. I laid out the story of the 5 years, the will reading, Jessica's behavior, and finally, the discovery of the journals. When I finished, I pushed the canvas bag across the polished table. "This is the proof," I said. "This is his voice." Ms. Sharma didn't touch the box immediately. She just looked at me, her expression thoughtful. "Sharon," she said, her voice calm and measured, "in cases like this, the bar for proving undue influence is very high. A court doesn't like to overturn a person's last will and testament. We have to prove 4 things: that your father was susceptible to influence due to his age and illness, that your sister had the opportunity to exert that influence, that she had the disposition to do so for improper personal gain, and that the result, the will itself, clearly S. How's the effects of that influence?" "It's all in there," I insisted, tapping the bag. "Every single point." For the next 2 hours, we sat at that table while she read. She didn't read every word, but she was methodical, pulling out the journals I'd tabbed and focusing on the highlighted passages. She was silent, her face unreadable, except for the occasional, minute tightening of her jaw. The only sounds were the rustle of pages and the distant city traffic. Finally, she closed the last journal and looked up at me. A slow, determined smile spread across her face. "This is it," she said, and the relief that washed over me was so intense I felt lightheaded. "This is the clearest evidence of a sustained, calculated campaign of undue influence I have seen in my entire career." His own words, in his own hand, documenting the coercion in real time, it's a litigation attorney's dream. She leaned forward, her professional calm now charged with an electric energy. "Your sister made 2 critical mistakes. First, she underestimated your father. She saw him as a frail old man, not as a meticulous architect who documented everything. Second, she underestimated you. She wrote you off as a passive, emotional pushover who would just cry and pack her bags." "So what do we do?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "We fight," she said, her eyes gleaming. "We file a petition to contest the will on the grounds of undue influence. We will subpoena her phone records, her emails with your father and Mr. Klein. We will request a deposition where I get to question her, under oath, about every single lie she told." She explained the process. It would be long, expensive, and emotionally draining. Jessica would fight back, hard. She would likely try to paint me as a bitter, greedy daughter who was angry she got cut out of the will. "She will try to assassinate your character, Sharon," Ms. Sharma warned. "Are you prepared for that?" I thought of my father, his shaky handwriting, his fear and confusion. I thought of Jessica's smug, triumphant face on that Zoom call. "Yes," I said, my voice clear and strong. "Let her try." Ms. Sharma nodded, satisfied. "Good. Now about my fee, I work on a contingency basis for cases this strong. That means I don't get paid unless you do. I'll take a percentage of the assets we recover. It's a risk for me, but in this case," she patted the stack of journals, "I think it's a very sound investment." Leaving her office that day, I felt like I was walking on air. The weight of the world was still on my shoulders, but now I wasn't carrying it alone. I had a fierce, brilliant advocate in my corner, and I had my father's truth, boxed up and ready for battle. The first shot was fired a week later. Ms. Sharma formally filed the petition. The legal notice was sent to Jessica in London and to her lawyer, Mr. Klein. The response was swift. A letter from a high-powered, aggressive law firm in the city stating that their client, Jessica, was deeply distressed by her sister's baseless and hurtful allegations. They claimed the will was a true and accurate reflection of their father's wishes, and that they would vigorously defend against this transparent attempt to extort money from the estate. Transparent attempt to extort money. The words were designed to wound, to make me feel small and greedy. A week ago, they might have, but now they just fueled the cold fire inside me. "Let them posture," Ms. Sharma said over the phone. "This is standard procedure. They're trying to scare you into backing down before we even get to discovery. They have no idea what we have. They think it's your word against theirs. They don't know that we have a third person in the room, your father." The foundation of Jessica's entire story, the story of a loving, successful daughter and her grateful father, was a lie, and we were about to prove it. We weren't just challenging a will. We were about to demolish the entire fraudulent structure she had built around my father's legacy, brick by painful brick. The legal battle dragged on for months, a slow-moving war of paperwork and procedural motions. Jessica's lawyers tried everything to block us. They filed motions to dismiss, claiming our case was frivolous. They argued the journals were inadmissible, calling them the unreliable ramblings of a sick man. Ms. Sharma calmly and methodically dismantled every one of their arguments, presenting a judge with carefully selected excerpts from the journals that demonstrated my father's clarity and intent. The judge denied their motions and ordered discovery to proceed. We had our first major victory. The day of Jessica's deposition was cold and overcast, the sky the color of slate. She had been forced to fly in from London. We met in a sterile conference room at a neutral law firm. It was the first time I had seen my sister in person in over a year. She was thinner, her face taut with stress, but she was dressed in an expensive, severe-looking suit, her armor for the day. She wouldn't look at me, her gaze fixed on her lawyer, a slick, aggressive man named Peterson. I sat next to Ms. Sharma, who was the picture of calm authority. Between us on the table was a single, neat stack of papers, photocopied, highlighted pages from the journals. The originals were safely in a vault. A court stenographer sat at the end of the table, her fingers poised over her machine. After swearing the oath, the deposition began. Ms. Sharma started gently, asking basic questions about Jessica's relationship with our father, her career, her life abroad. Jessica's answers were smooth and polished. She painted a picture of a devoted daughter, constantly in touch, always concerned for his welfare. "I was so worried about him," she said, her voice catching slightly. "And about Sharon. She was so isolated, so overwhelmed. I was constantly offering to get more help to ease her burden." Ms. Sharma let her speak, letting her build her own stage. Then, she picked up the first page from her stack. "Ms. Jessica's last name," she said, her tone shifting from conversational to surgical. "I'm looking at an entry from your father's journal, dated June 4th, 3 years ago. In it, he writes, 'Jessica asked again about power of attorney, said it would be easier for her to manage my finances from London.' Do you recall that conversation?" Jessica blinked. A flicker of surprise crossed her face before her lawyer could school her expression. I might have. I was just trying to be helpful." "Helpful," Ms. Sharma repeated. "So helpful, in fact, that you found him a new lawyer, Mr. Klein, to draft a new will. Is that correct?" "Our father felt his previous lawyer wasn't suited to his needs," Jessica said stiffly. "Or is it that his previous lawyer, who had known your father for 30 years, would have recognized that your father would never, under normal circumstances, disinherit the daughter who was his sole caregiver?" "Objection," Peterson snapped. "Speculation." "I'll rephrase," Ms. Sharma said smoothly, never taking her eyes off Jessica. "Did you, at any point, tell your father that you believed your sister, Sharon, was becoming financially dependent on him?" Jessica's composure began to crack. "I may have expressed some concern for Sharon's future, yes. I love my sister. I wanted her to be able to have her own life." "How noble of you," Ms. Sharma said, her voice dripping with irony. She picked up another page. "Let's turn to an entry from 8 months ago. Your father writes that you cried on the phone, claiming Sharon wasn't being honest about his condition. He writes, she said the only thing that would give her peace of mind would be knowing that the estate was secure, that there was a clear plan. Do you remember manipulating your ailing father with your tears?" Ms. Jessica's last name. Objection, argumentative, harassment. Peterson was practically shouting. "I never manipulated my father," Jessica shot back, her voice rising. "I loved him. I was the one who was successful, who made him proud. Sharon just stayed. She didn't have anything else going on." It was the first crack in her facade, the first glimpse of the venomous contempt she truly felt for me. I remained silent, my hands clasped in my lap, letting the journals speak for me. The final blow came when Ms. Sharma presented the last, most crucial entry. She read it aloud, slowly and clearly. The entry where Dad detailed Jessica's promise to split everything fairly, and how she had convinced him to sign the will by saying it was the smartest financial move to protect the assets from my lack of financial planning. As Ms. Sharma read the words, "It sounds like a betrayal," but she cried and said I was questioning her love. Jessica's face went white. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving behind a pasty, sickly pallor. She looked at the paper on the table as if it were a snake. That's not true," she stammered. "He was confused. His mind wasn't right." "Are you suggesting your father was not of sound mind when he wrote this?" Ms. Sharma asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "Because your own lawyer has been arguing for months that he was of perfectly sound mind when he signed the will you presented. You can't have it both ways, Jessica. Was he lucid enough to sign a legal document disinheriting one daughter, but too confused to write truthfully in his private journal on the very same day?" Silence. The trap had been sprung. Jessica looked at her lawyer, her eyes wide with panic. He had no answer. She had walked right into it. Any response she gave would either invalidate the will or confirm her deception. She stared down at the table, her shoulders slumping in defeat. The confident, powerful venture capitalist was gone. In her place was a cornered liar, exposed by the words of the very man she had sought to control. The deposition ended shortly after that, as we pack. "Get up our things," Jessica finally looked at me. Her eyes were filled not with remorse, but with a cold, hard hatred. It was the look of a predator who had been outsmarted. I met her gaze and held it, my expression neutral. I didn't need to gloat. The journals had already won. Later that evening, Ms. Sharma called me. "They want to settle," she said. "Peterson called me before I even got back to the office. They're offering a 50-50 split of the estate, provided the journals are sealed and never made public. They are terrified of this going to trial." "No," I said instantly, surprising even myself. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "No," Ms. Sharma asked. "Not 50-50, I clarified. That was the deal she was supposed to honor in the first place. There has to be a consequence for what she did. All legal fees for both sides are to be paid out of her share of the estate, and I want the house, free and clear. Whatever is left after that, she can have." It was a bold demand, a punitive one, but it wasn't about the money. It was about justice. It was about the fact that her actions had a cost, and she was going to be the one to pay it. Ms. Sharma was silent for a moment. Then I heard her smile through the phone. "I'll draw up the offer," she said. "I have a feeling she'll take it." Jessica took the deal. Her lawyers tried to haggle, of course, but Ms. Sharma held firm. The threat of having those journals read in open court, of having her calculated emotional abuse of our father laid bare for the public record, was too great a risk. For a woman who had built her identity around an image of brilliant success, the public humiliation would have been a career ender. She chose the financial loss over the personal ruin. The settlement process was swift and impersonal, handled entirely by the lawyers. I signed the final papers in Ms. Sharma's office. When it was done, she handed me a file. Inside was the new, undisputed deed to the house at 123 Maple Lane in my name alone. Holding it felt surreal. It wasn't a victory prize, it was a reclamation. This house was never just an asset. It was my home, my father's sanctuary, the place where I had sacrificed 5 years of my life out of love, not obligation. I never spoke to Jessica again. I received one final email from her the night the settlement was finalized. It was short and seething with rage. "I hope you're happy," it read. "You destroyed our family over a house." I stared at the message, a bitter laugh bubbling up inside me. She thought I had destroyed the family. The lack of self-awareness was staggering. I typed a single, simple reply. "He knew you would lie. He just didn't know I would have the strength to prove it." I hit send, and then I blocked her email address and her phone number. I didn't need her voice, real or digital, in my life ever again. The first thing I did as the sole legal owner of the house was to unpack. I went through the boxes that had sat in the living room for months, symbols of my impending exile. But now, as I unwrapped my belongings, it felt like a rebirth. I put my graphic design magazines on the coffee table. I set up my easel in the sunniest room in the house, which had been Dad's bedroom. I cleared out his study, carefully packing his architectural books and drawings, preserving his professional legacy. But the room itself, I made my own. I brought in my powerful computer, my drawing tablets, and my reference books. My freelance business, which had been relegated to late nights and stolen moments, now had a place to flourish. The silence in the house was different now. It was no longer the heavy, grief-stricken silence from the week after Dad passed, nor the anxious, tense silence from the months I awaited my fate. It was a peaceful silence, a silence of possibility. I kept the journals. They were mine now, part of the settlement. I put them back in their cardboard box and placed them on the top shelf of my closet. They were not a trophy. They were a reminder of my father's love, of my own resilience, and of the fact that truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of finding the light. A few months later, Brenda, the nurse, stopped by with a potted orchid. "A housewarming gift," she said with a warm smile. "But I've lived here for years," I laughed. "No," she said, her eyes knowing. "You were a caregiver here, now you live here, it's different." She was right. I was finally living again. I started taking on creative projects, the kind that filled me with passion instead of just paying the bills. I reconnected with old friends, inviting them over for dinner in the house they had thought I was going to lose. I started exploring my own city again, realizing how much I had missed. The money from the remainder of the estate, after the house and legal fees were settled, was enough to give me a cushion, a sense of security I had never had before. It wasn't a windfall, but it was freedom. It was the freedom to say no to bad clients, the freedom to travel, the freedom to rebuild my life on my own terms. It was the independence my father had truly wanted for me, delivered not by Jessica's empty promises, but by his own forethought. Sometimes, when the house is quiet at night, I think about my father. I don't think about the sick, confused man from the last few months. I think about the man in the journals, the man who loved his home, who saw the good in me, and who was wise enough to know that the most powerful weapon against a lie is the simple, unvarnished truth, written in ink. He hadn't erased me. He had empowered me. And in the end, his true will was done.